young couple went camping in the woods, but only one of them came out alive. The survivor told two different versions of what happened. So it took forensic psychiatry, ballistics, and Korean War history to discover what really happened in the deep forests of Oregon. The area surrounding 3 days later, Kendra went to the local sheriff's office and called her mother with some terrible news.
She says, "Julio's dead. It was a terrible accident. Will you come and get me?"
Kendra said that the three of them had gone fishing. Tom took a lie detector test and passed. Police ruled Julio's death an accident.
The sheriff's department was very supportive of Tom Brown. I think that they believed the stories and that they wanted to keep an innocent man from being locked behind bars.
But a few days later, Kendra changed her story.
Then we'd at least have equal evidence against him.
But she failed.
Polygraphs do not measure truth or lie. What they measure is emotion. And if you were a 16-year-old girl that had been raped and marched up in the mountain and God saved you, brought you down out of that mountain, you're emotional, you're talking about your husband that you loved that was shot by this murderer, would you be emotional? I think so.
With nowhere else to turn, investigators looked more closely at the physical evidence. The dog's wound would tell whether he was shot frontally, as Tom Brown claimed, or from behind, which was Kendra's version. Unfortunately, the dog's body had not been autopsied, and he was buried in a mass grave for animals. The bullet that killed Julio entered his cheek and passed nearly horizontally through his upper vertebrae.
Trajectories could vary depending on terrain and a whole variety of other factors of how the gun was held, whether the person receiving it was standing uphill or downhill.
A trajectory analysis wasn't enough to tell whether the shooting was an accident or intentional. But they couldn't understand how Tom Brown passed his polygraph.
We believed her, but she'd flunked the polygraph. We didn't believe him, but he'd passed, and so what do? Well, what are our other options?
So prosecutors asked a forensic psychiatrist how Kendra could have failed her polygraph, and his discovery changed the course of the investigation. Interviewed Kendra for several hours.
I concluded that she didn't have any mental disorder. She was under some stress because she'd had a stressful experience, but that was all.
But why did Kendra initially vouch for Tom Brown, the man she now says killed her husband?
Frankly, at first I didn't know what to make about it. I remembered the stories of what happened to the prisoners of war in the Korean War, and where they were isolated, often brutalized, often for fear of their life. And after a long period of time, some of them would accept the point of view of their captor and then testify against their own country. And they called it at the time brainwashing.
Today it's known as the Stockholm Syndrome, named for the hostages held in a Stockholm bank robbery who sympathized with their captors even while their lives were threatened. Experts say this occurs to hostages when four things happen: a traumatic shock, isolation, indoctrination, and the promise of a reward.
The shooting of the dog gives a very visual and powerful demonstration of the dangerousness of the man that was her captor, and brings it home. And then being assaulted physically, pretty powerful stuff, you know.
Was that then she wouldn't feel guilty about being an instrument of her husband's death.
Kendra didn't just accept Brown's story of an accidental shooting. She actually believed it.
I had nobody with me but a murderer. Do I really want to believe he's a murderer because believing that is terrifying? Do I really want to think that my husband died so that someone could rape me and kidnap me? For me, denial was the best way to survive.
Proved that Julio had been murdered.
She could testify to what he said. She could testify about what happened to the dog, and so on. But we had a crime committed without an eyewitness. And this was a very, very close case.
Pattern. There were other test shots at increasing distances.
So then you get to a point where you have no pattern at all. It doesn't show up at all. And that was what the DA was primarily interested in. How far before you don't have anything?
The rifle had to be 36 inches away from the target to leave no trace of gunpowder. This meant that Brown's rifle was at least 3 feet away when the trigger was pulled.
To have muzzle to target distance of 3 feet and a level entry and exit wound, how do you contort yourself to be able to do that when he's claiming all he was doing is passing the gun along?
With this forensic evidence, Tom Brown was arrested and charged with murder. Based on the ballistic evidence, prosecutors were convinced that Tom Brown murdered Julio Torres in the Oregon forest to have his 16-year-old wife. All evidence, but prosecutors still felt they needed the forensic evidence.
That evidence was important. But all those kinds of evidence are always subject to human frailties and cross-examination and credibility and bias and so forth. And of course, the powerful nature of forensic evidence is it's not subject to those things.
Kendra Torres testified in detail about her ordeal. Tom Brown told his version and tried to demonstrate how the alleged accident took place.
He tried to hand off that rifle, and you can't do it. And he stuck to his guns, and I believe stuck to a lie, but it was demonstrated to be that.
Brown was so confident that he waived the jury trial. The verdict from the judge was guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison.
And the type of gun that was used and the powder burns were all proof that this, that it did not happen the way that he said it did. So I was very thankful for that evidence.
You have 5 witnesses to a crime, you're probably going to get 5 different scenarios. You do the forensic science, you're going to get 1. And that's it.
Of a homicide. After doing some Christmas shopping, 16-year-old Leanne Tiernan decided not to take the bus home, but instead to take a shortcut through a wooded area in Leeds, England, known as Hoffley Gill.
I had told her before not to go down there, especially when it was dark and dingy down there. It's not too bad during the day, but on a night it could be a bit not very nice.
When Leanne didn't arrive home as planned, her family went looking for her.
She may have fallen, possibly broken her leg, and then I decided to call the police because there was no sign of her.
For days, police scoured the area with no luck.
We searched 1,000 houses from top to bottom, but it didn't produce one piece of evidence that could link to explain what had happened to this girl.
We'd found absolutely no evidence of anything connected to Leanne. It was simply as if she'd vanished off the face of the earth.
Hello! Welcome to my talk show.
There was nothing at school that was a problem to her. We couldn't find any boyfriend in the background that perhaps would have explained why she'd not come home. From that point onwards, we structured the whole case as if it was a potential murder inquiry.
A television network broadcast a recreation of Leanne's walk home. In it, Leanne's sister wore the same outfit Leanne was wearing on the night she disappeared. This broadcast generated one promising lead.
And one witness did talk to us about having seen a man in Huffley Gill on numerous occasions and told us that he had a black and tan small dog.
We traced 70 plus people who walked the dogs in that area, and through a process of elimination, by showing the witness the dog walker and the dogs, we were able to eliminate all 70 plus.
The printed lot numbers revealed the ties were standard issue, available through many retail outlets. But one yellow tie yielded an important clue. Its lot number showed it had been manufactured exclusively for the British postal system, which comprises the Royal Mail and the Parcel Force.
Useful information, but there are several thousand people who work for both companies, so it wasn't going to provide us with a name.
The killer used an unusual dog collar to wrap the garbage bags around Leanne's body. Investigators now knew the killer had a dog, red carpet in his home, and worked for the Postal Service. Now, all they had to do was find him. The forensic evidence revealed Leanne Tiernan's body had been frozen before it was dumped in the woods almost a year after she was murdered. If the killer kept the body in his freezer, he probably lived alone. There was further evidence that he lived near a privet hedge and a poplar tree, had red carpet in his home, and a dog. And he most likely worked for the Postal Service, where he obtained the distinctive yellow cable ties. The last item for scientists to analyze was the dog collar used to fasten the garbage bag over Leanne's head.
It did appear to be a good quality dog collar, and it did have some distinctive features about it. The nature of the stitching, the thickness of the leather, the color of the leather.
Detective David Wilson was assigned the task of...
There were only 3 people from Yorkshire and only 1 person from Leeds who appeared on that list. This was a John Taylor of Cockshot Drive in Leeds, and he'd bought 6 of these dog collars.
Poaching and hunting, this was seemingly his supply of food. We found that he had been cruel to animals, particularly in the killing process of animals.
Investigators also discovered that Taylor met women through Lonely Hearts newspaper ads.
We're checking telephone bills of his, and we found that he was making literally thousands upon thousands of calls to newspaper datelines. And he'd met quite a number of ladies and partners through this.
When we spoke to one female acquaintance in particular, she told us that he would like to take her up into his bedroom, that he would like to place a cable tie behind each of her wrists, and then tie that cable tie together, and then put a scarf over her face and have quite violent sex with her.
3 cable ties tied together, 1 around each wrist and 1 linking the 2 together, which was precisely the same way that he'd tied Leanne Tiernan up.
When police searched Taylor's home, they were surprised to see that there was no red carpet in his home, and he didn't have a black and tan dog. Was it possible that John Taylor was the wrong man? Up against the nail while carrying a bag. The trash bag fragment was the same brand as the type found with Leanne's body.
We found 2 dog collars, which were identical to those ordered from Armitage's. In addition to that, we found an amount of twine, and that was forensically examined and found to be identical to that recovered from Leanne.
In the backyard, scientists found a broken cable tie identical to the one around Leanne's wrists. And there was also a poplar tree and a privet hedge consistent with the pollen found in Leanne's hair. When police excavated Taylor's yard, they made a gruesome discovery. they found the corpse of a black and tan terrier.
We felt that Taylor had killed this dog as soon as he'd heard media appeals trying to identify that person, who he knew to be himself.
The hair from Taylor's dog was microscopically similar to the dog hair found with Leanne's body. John Taylor was arrested and charged with Leanne's murder. When confronted with the overwhelming forensic evidence, Taylor confessed. He admitted abducting Leanne as she walked along the wooded path and forcing her to walk a half-mile back to his home. Taylor used a distinctive cable tie from work to tie her wrists, and at some point, he strangled her to death. The ice crystals in Leanne's heart tissue showed Taylor stored her body in the freezer. Almost 9 months later, he covered the body with garbage bags and the bed cover and fastened them with the black twine and the dog collar, which was traced to Taylor through his internet purchase.
There's no doubt in my mind that John Taylor set out to kill on that Sunday. Leanne Tiernan was in the wrong place at the wrong time. This man is a predator. It could have been any woman that afternoon who fell into his hands. She was subject to the most savage, brutal, and callous attack imaginable.
Although Taylor admitted the abduction, he insisted Leanne's death was an accident, claiming she had fallen and hit her head on the floor. But this was a lie, since the autopsy showed no such injury.
He couldn't explain how the girl had been strangled with a plastic cable tie and a double knotted scarf. He couldn't account for that at all.
Investigators find it hard to believe that Taylor left so much forensic evidence. Pollen from his garden, carpet fibers, the distinctive cable tie, the twine, garbage bags, the hairs from the dog, all bore Taylor's signature.
John Taylor's not as clever as he thought he was. He didn't leave his DNA. He didn't leave fingerprints, but he left items there that led a trail back to him, and that was his undoing.
John Taylor was found guilty of kidnapping and murder and was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. 14 years earlier, another woman had been sexually assaulted in the same area where Leanne's body was found. The biological evidence from that case proved that John Taylor was the perpetrator. For that crime, and one other to which Taylor confessed, he received 2 additional life sentences. But no one is convinced that all of John Taylor's deadly secrets have been unearthed.
There are 4 murders that we're investigating in very great detail. One of the cases actually involves a prostitute whose body was found buried in the same woods that Leanne was later found.
Without forensic evidence, Taylor would not have been implicated in any of these crimes.
I think what satisfied me most about this case was the fact that we weren't relying on very powerful DNA or very powerful fingerprints evidence to identify an offender. It was old-fashioned forensics, if you like. It was fibers, it was hairs, it was the construction of various items, and all these things came together to provide some extremely powerful evidence.
The rain began just after midnight, washing the streets of a small Florida town until the pavement reflected every streetlight like broken glass. At 12:47 a.m., a patrol officer noticed a sedan parked beside an abandoned citrus grove. The driver's door was open. The interior light was still glowing. The engine was cold. Inside the car was a purse, a set of keys, a half-finished cup of coffee, and a photograph of a young woman smiling beside a birthday cake. Her name was Emily Carter. She was 28 years old. She had disappeared only hours earlier. By sunrise, the Grove would become the center of a murder investigation that would haunt the community for decades. By the following afternoon, investigators would find Emily S. body less than half a mile from the abandoned vehicle, and by the end of the week, the case would already be beginning to collapse under conflicting statements, missing evidence, and a suspect who seemed to know far more than he was willing to admit. But nobody could have imagined that the truth would remain buried for 36 years. At the time, Emily's disappearance seemed almost impossible. She was not someone who vanished without warning. She had a job, a family, friends, a routine. Every evening after work, she stopped at the same small grocery store. She usually called her mother before heading home. She never disappeared for hours without telling someone. On the night of October 18th, still 1990, that routine changed. Emily left work at 6:12 p.m. A co-worker saw her walk toward the parking lot. She waved. She smiled. Nothing seemed wrong. At 6:26, Emily stopped at the grocery store. The cashier remembered her buying coffee, bread, and a small package of birthday candles. The next day was her younger brother Daniel's birthday. At 6:41, she called her mother. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. Emily said she would be home soon. Those were the last confirmed words anyone heard from her. At 7:03, a neighbor saw Emily's car heading east. At 7:19, a gas station camera captured the same vehicle. Then nothing. Her phone stopped answering. Her house remained dark. By 10 p.m., her family knew something was wrong. They called friends, hospitals, police. Nobody had seen her. At 12:47 a.m., the patrol officer found the abandoned sedan. The scene immediately raised questions. The driver's door was open. The purse was still inside. Her wallet was still inside. Her identification was still inside. There was no obvious sign of a struggle. No broken glass. No blood. No weapon. The only strange detail was the passenger seat. It had been pushed backward, farther than Emily normally kept it. The officer wrote that detail into the report, but nobody understood its importance. Not yet. At 4:18 a.m., a search team entered the citrus grove. The Florida air was heavy, warm, wet. The smell of orange trees filled the darkness. Then a search dog stopped. The handler followed. 20 yards into the trees, they found a woman's then another, then a trail through the wet grass. At 4:43 a.m., investigators found Emily. She was lying beneath a cluster of trees. Her death was immediately treated as suspicious. The scene was sealed. Photographs were taken. Evidence markers covered the ground. For the first time, the town understood that this was no longer a missing person case. It was murder. Emily's mother collapsed when police told her. Her brother refused to believe it. He kept saying the same sentence. She was coming home. But she never did. The investigation began before sunrise. Detectives interviewed everyone who knew Emily, co-workers, neighbors, friends, family, anyone who had spoken to her during the previous 24 hours. One name surfaced quickly: Mark Holloway, Emily's former boyfriend. They had dated for nearly 3 years. The relationship ended 6 months early. Friends described the breakup as difficult. There had been arguments, jealousy, several angry phone calls. Holloway admitted he had argued with Emily 2 days before her death, but he insisted he had not seen her that night. His alibi seemed solid. He said he had been working late at an auto repair shop. 3 co-workers confirmed he was there. The police checked. Their statements matched. Still, investigators focused on him because in a murder case, the former boyfriend was an obvious suspect, and Emily's family knew it. Rumors spread quickly. By the end of the week, people were whispering that Holloway had killed her, but investigators had a problem. There was no physical evidence connecting him to the scene. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witness, nothing. Then investigators discovered a second person, a man named Robert Gaines. Gaines worked security at a nearby warehouse. He had reported seeing Emily's car near the Grove that evening. At first, he said he saw it around 8 o'clock. Later, he changed the time. He said it may have been closer to 7:30, then 7:15. The changing timeline made detectives suspicious. When asked why he had been in the area, Gaines said he was checking a security alarm, but there was no alarm, no service call, no record. The security company had not sent him there. Gaines eventually admitted he had driven through the area because he was meeting someone. He refused to say who. That refusal became one of the first major mysteries. Meanwhile, investigators examined Emily's car. The vehicle was surprisingly clean. Too clean. The driver's door had no usable fingerprints. The steering wheel had been wiped. The gear shift had been wiped. Even the door handle had been cleaned. Someone had taken the time to remove evidence. But there was one place they missed: the passenger side window. A partial fingerprint remained along the inside edge. It was too damaged for identification in 1990. The print was photographed, cataloged, stored, then forgotten. That single fingerprint would sit in an evidence archive for decades. Nobody knew whose hand had left it. Nobody knew why it was there. And nobody knew that modern technology would eventually give it a name. The first months of the investigation produced little. Holloway remained a person of interest. Gaines remained suspicious. Several other men were interviewed. No charges were filed. The case slowly disappeared from the headline. Emily's family refused to let it disappear from their list. Her mother kept her bedroom exactly as it had been. Her birthday cards remained unopened. Her winter clothes stayed in the closet. Her brother kept the photograph from the kitchen, the one showing Emily smiling beside the birthday cake. He kept it because it was the last photograph taken before her death. Years passed. The citrus grove changed. New roads were built. Businesses opened. Others closed. People moved away. Children grew up. The detectives who had worked the original case retired. Some died. The evidence remained. Boxes stacked inside a storage facility. Old photographs. Old reports. Old tapes. Old fingerprints. Old assumptions. And one unanswered question: who killed Emily Carter? For years, the answer seemed to be Mark Holloway, but the evidence never supported it. Then, in 2004, a retired detective reopened the file. He noticed something the original investigation had missed: the passenger seat. Emily was a small woman. She usually sat close to the steering wheel, but when her car was found, the passenger seat had been pushed far back. That suggested someone else had occupied it. Someone taller. Someone who had needed the extra space. The detective checked the original photograph. There was another detail: a faint smear on the passenger side door. The investigators had labeled it unidentified residue. Modern testing was impossible at the time, but the sample had been preserved. The detective requested new testing. The result was inconclusive. Still, the file was marked for future review. Then the case went quiet again. Until 2018. A forensic laboratory began digitizing old evidence. Emily's fingerprint photograph was scanned. Technicians enhanced it. The partial print became clearer. And suddenly, the old case had a new direction. The print was compared against a national database. No match. Then investigators tried something else. They compared it with known associates of Emily, family, friends, former co-workers, former boyfriend. Still nothing. Then the fingerprint was entered into a broader forensic system. A partial match appeared. The name was not Mark Holloway. It was not Robert Gaines. It belonged to a man named Daniel Rusk. Rusk had been 29 years old in 1990. He had worked as a delivery driver. He had lived less than 3 miles from the citrus grove, and according to old employment records, he had delivered packages to Emily's workplace. But that was not the shocking part. Rusk had never been interviewed. Not once. His name did not appear in the original case file. Investigators searched his history. In 1992, he had left Florida. In 1997, he moved to Georgia. In 2008, he relocated to Tennessee. He had no major criminal record. He had married, had children, built a quiet life. For decades, nobody had connected him to Emily's death until the fingerprint. Investigators obtained a court-authorized fingerprint comparison. The match was confirmed. The print on Emily's passenger window belonged to Daniel Rusk. The case had just changed. But detectives still needed to know what. Why had Rusk been inside Emily's car? Why had he never been questioned? And how had his fingerprint survived for nearly 3 decades? Investigators searched old delivery records. There it was, October 18th, Sill 1990. Rusk had made a delivery to Emily's workplace at 5:47 p.m. The delivery log showed something unusual. He had signed for the package himself. The destination was not the office. It was Emily's department. That meant he had seen her shortly before she disappeared. Then investigators discovered a second delivery. Rusk had made another stop at the same building 6 days earlier and another 2 days before that. He had been there repeatedly. But there was more. Emily had written something in her plan. The entry was short. Delivery guy asking questions. No name. No explanation. Just for words. Investigators stared at the page. The man whose fingerprint had been found inside her abandoned car had been asking questions about her. And suddenly the old murder no longer looked like a random encounter. It looked personal. The investigators contacted Rusk. He was now 65. When detectives arrived at his Tennessee home, he looked confused. Then they showed him Emily's photograph. His expression changed. He remembered her. He admitted delivering packages to her workplace, but he denied ever entering her car. When investigators told him about the fingerprint, he became silent. Then he said, "I never touched that window." It was the first lie, and investigators knew it, because the fingerprint was not the only evidence connecting Daniel Rusk to Emily Carter. There was something else. A tiny piece of blue fabric had been recovered from the Grove in 1990. It had never been identified. New DNA testing had been performed years later. The profile did not match Emily. It did not match Holloway. It did not match Gaines. And when investigators compared it against Daniel Rusk's DNA, the result came back with a match. The man who said he had never touched Emily's car had left his fingerprint inside it. The man who said he had never been near the Grove had left biological evidence there. The cold case was beginning to crack, but there was still one question. If Rusk was responsible, why had he killed Emily? And what happened between the moment she left work and the moment her body was found? The answer was hidden in another forgotten record. A police dispatch tape. The tape had been recorded on the night Emily disappeared. Most of it was routine. Call, traffic stops, noise complaints. Then, at 7:31 p.m., an officer reported seeing a dark pickup truck parked behind Emily's sedan. The plate number was incomplete, but one detail was clear. The truck belonged to Daniel Rusk. The officer had noticed it. He had written it down. Then he had moved on. That note had never made it into the main case file. For 36 years it had been sitting in an old dispatch archive. Now investigators had the missing link. Emily's car, Rusk's fingerprint, Rusk's DNA, Rusk's vehicle, and a witness report placing him beside her car minutes after she left work. But investigators still did not know what happened inside that vehicle. Then they recovered something from the original evidence box, a cassette tape. One side was labeled, Carter, Final Interview. The recording had never been transcribed. When investigators played it, they heard a voice, a witness, a man who had never spoken publicly. He claimed he saw Emily arguing with someone beside her car. He described the man. Tall, dark jacket, short hair, and a distinctive scar across his chin. Investigators searched Daniel Rusk's old photographs. There it was, a scar, exactly where the witness had described it. The voice on the tape continued. The witness said Emily was shouting. Then the man opened the passenger door. Emily stepped inside. The witness watched the car leave. He said he assumed they knew each other. He did not know he had just watched the beginning of a murder. The recording ended. The room was silent. For 36 years, the truth had been sitting on a cassette, and nobody had pressed play. Now detectives knew the man who entered Emily's car. They knew the man who left his fingerprint. They knew whose DNA had been recovered from the Grove. They knew whose truck had been seen beside her vehicle. But one mystery remained. Why had Rusk chosen Emily? And when investigators searched his old property records, they found a document that suggested the answer was much closer to home than anyone had imagined. A document dated 3 days before Emily disappeared, signed by Emily herself. And beneath her signature was the name of a person she had been preparing to expose. The name beneath Emily Carteret's signature was Daniel Rusk. Investigators stared at the document for several seconds before anyone spoke. It was a complaint, not a police report, not a lawsuit. A private statement Emily had prepared 3 days before her death. She had written that Rusk had approached her repeatedly at work. At first, she described him as persistent, then intrusive, then threatening. She claimed he had asked questions about shipments passing through her department, questions that had nothing to do with his delivery job, which companies received certain packages, who signed for them, which employees stayed late, which records were stored in the back office. Emily had written one sentence twice. He knows things he should not know. That line changed everything. The investigators went back through Rusk's employment history. He had been a delivery driver for a regional logistics company. His job gave him access to dozens of offices. He knew schedules. He knew loading areas. He knew which employees worked late. He knew which buildings had cameras. And according to former co-workers, he was unusually interested in security procedures. One co-worker remembered Rusk asking about police response time. Another remembered him asking how long delivery records were kept. At the time, nobody thought much of it. In 1990, those questions sounded strange. 3 decades later, they sounded terrifying. But the complaint contained something even more important. Emily had written that she believed Rusk was connected to another man. She did not know his full name. She called him the man from the warehouse. Investigators immediately searched old records. There had been a warehouse less than 2 miles from the citrus grove. It belonged to a company called Suncoast Distribution. Rusk had made deliveries there, but the warehouse had closed in 1996. The building had been demolished years later. The property was now a shopping center. Still, investigators found archived employee records. One name appeared repeatedly beside Rusk: Calvin Mercer. Mercer had been a supervisor at Suncoast Distribution. He had also been questioned in the original investigation, only once. His statement was short. He claimed he knew Emily only professionally. He said he had never met her outside work, but the new evidence suggested otherwise. Investigators found a photograph from a company picnic. Emily was standing near the edge of the frame. Calvin Mercer was only a few feet away, and Daniel Rusk was standing behind them. 3 people. 1 photograph. 36 years of silence. The investigators searched Emily's belongings again. They found a small address book. Most entries were ordinary. Friends, co-workers, family. Then, near the back, a handwritten note. CM Warehouse? Next to it was a phone number. The number had been disconnected decades ago, but investigators traced the old telephone records. The number belonged to Calvin Mercer. That meant Emily had contacted him. The original investigators had never known. Why? The answer appeared in another document, a page from Emily's personal journal. She had written that Mercer had offered to meet her. He said he wanted to explain why certain company records were disappearing. Emily believed he knew something. She wrote, "He says Rusk is not working alone." The sentence sent a chill through the investigation. Rusk was not working alone. That possibility had never appeared in the original case. Investigators returned to Daniel Rusk's interview. They asked him about Mercer. He denied knowing him. Again, the detectives showed him the photograph. Rusk looked at it, then looked away. They asked how long he had known Mercer. He said he could not remember. They showed him the old delivery records. Rusk said he had delivered packages to Suncoast. They showed him phone records. He said he did not remember making calls. Then the detective placed Emily's complaint on the table. Rusk stared at the page. His hands began shaking. For the first time, his calm expression disappeared. He asked, "Where did you get that?" The detective answered, "From her files." Rusk said nothing. The room went silent. Then he asked another question. "Does anyone else know about this?" The detective looked at him. "Why?" Rusk lowered his eyes. Because she wasn't supposed to keep it. That sentence became one of the most important statements in the case. She wasn't supposed to keep it. Investigators asked what he meant. Rusk refused to answer. They asked who had told him. Nothing. They asked what Emily had discovered. Silence. The interview ended. But the investigators now knew something crucial. Emily had not been killed randomly. She had discovered something. Something involving Rusk. Something involving Mercer. And possibly something inside the logistics company where she worked. Investigators obtained archived corporate records. The company had been investigated for financial irregularities in 1991. Millions of dollars in shipments were unaccounted for. Several invoices had been altered. Some packages had been listed as destroyed. Others had been recorded as delivered when they never arrived. The case had never resulted in major charges. At the time, the company blamed accounting error. But Emily had worked in records. She had seen the paperwork. And she had apparently discovered that the missing shipments were not mistakes. They were deliberate. The investigators followed the names on the old documents. One name appeared beside several suspicious transactions. Calvin Mercer. Another appeared beside delivery authorization. Daniel Rusk. Emily had been standing between them, and she may have realized what they were doing. The theory became darker. Rusk had access to the shipments. Mercer had access to the warehouse. Emily had access to the records. If she discovered the scheme, she could expose both men. And 3 days before her death, she wrote that Rusk was asking questions. 2 days later, she contacted Mercer. The following evening, she disappeared. The investigators reconstructed the final 24 hours. At 5:47 p.m., Rusk delivered a package. At 6:12, Emily left work. At 6:26, she stopped at the grocery store. At 6:41, she called her mother. At 7:03, she was seen driving east. At 7:19, the gas station camera captured her car. At 7:31, police dispatch recorded Rusk's truck beside her vehicle. At 7:34, the witness saw Emily arguing with a man. At 7:39, both vehicles left. At 8:02, Rusk's truck was seen near the warehouse. At 8:17, Emily's phone stopped transmitting. At 4:43 the next morning, her body was found. The timeline was almost complete, but there was a gap. 7 minutes. Between 7:39 and 7:46. 7 minutes when nobody knew where Emily was. 7 minutes when the witness lost sight of the vehicles. 7 minutes that might contain the entire murder. Investigators searched every surviving record. Traffic cameras did not exist in that area in 1990. There were no smartphones, no GPS, no digital tracking. But there was an old toll station. The road Rusk had taken passed through one. The toll operator's records were still archived. Most of the paper was damaged, but the time stamps remained. One vehicle passed at 7:44 p.m., a dark pickup, Rusk's truck, and behind it, 30 seconds later, Emily's sedan. That meant Emily was still alive at 7:44. The investigators now knew where she had gone. The truck led her toward the warehouse. But why would she follow Rusk? Because she knew him, or because she believed he was taking her to someone who could help. The evidence suggested the second possibility. Emily had been trying to expose the warehouse operation. She had contacted Mercer. Perhaps Rusk told her Mercer wanted to speak. Perhaps he convinced her to follow him. Perhaps she believed she was going to recover the missing documents. Instead, she drove into a trap. Investigators searched the old warehouse records. The building had a loading dock, a side entrance, and an office overlooking the storage floor. A former employee remembered something. On the night Emily disappeared, Mercer had told everyone to leave early. He said there was a security problem. One employee remembered seeing Rusk arrive. He also remembered seeing Emily's car, but he had never told police. When investigators found him, he was 73. He agreed to speak. His memory was fragmented, but one detail remained sharp. He said Emily was shouting. He could not hear every word, but he heard her say, "You promised me." Investigators asked who she was speaking to. He said, "Mercer." The room became silent. That meant Mercer was not merely connected to Emily. He had apparently promised her something: protection, information, or perhaps access to the documents she wanted. The witness continued. He said he saw Rusk grab Emily's arm. Then Mercer stepped between them. He could not hear what Mercer said, but Emily stopped fighting. For several seconds, everything appeared calm. Then the witness left. He never saw Emily alive again. The investigators asked why he had never told police. He admitted he was afraid. Mercer had threatened his job. Rusk had threatened his family. And the company had warned employees not to discuss what happened. The original investigation had never discovered any of this because the witness had remained silent for 36 years. Now his statement filled another gap. Emily had not been taken by a stranger. She had been led to the warehouse by someone she believed she could trust. The question became whether Mercer or Rusk delivered the fatal blow. The forensic evidence could not answer that. Emily's injuries were consistent with an assault involving a blunt object. No usable weapon had been recovered, but modern testing found traces of blood on an old piece of equipment stored in an evidence archive, a metal flashlight. It had been collected from the warehouse in 1990, then labeled as irrelevant. The flashlight had a broken strap. Its surface had been wiped, but a microscopic trace remained beneath the battery compartment. Investigators tested it. The DNA belonged to Emily. Another profile was also present: Daniel Rusk. The weapon had been sitting in evidence for 36 years. The investigators had finally found something physical connecting Rusk directly to Emily's death, but the evidence created another problem. If Rusk had attacked Emily, why was Mercer there? And if Mercer was involved, why had Rusk been the only person leaving biological evidence? The answer came from an old photograph of the warehouse, the office door, the loading dock, the equipment room, and a security camera mounted near the entrance. The camera had not been working that night, or so the original report said, but the camera had recorded something. The footage was stored on an obsolete magnetic tape. Technicians recovered it. Most of the image was distorted, dark, grainy, barely visible. Then, at 7:52 p.m., a figure crossed the frame. Another followed. A third appeared several seconds later. The first was Daniel Rusk. The second was Calvin Mercer. The third figure was Emily. She was still standing, still moving, still alive. Then the tape showed something that had never been seen before. Mercer opened the warehouse office. Rusk pushed Emily inside. The door closed. 5 minutes later, Mercer emerged alone. He looked toward the camera. Then he walked out of frame. Rusk followed, but Emily did not. The footage ended there. The investigators watched it again and again. Then one detective noticed something in Mercer's hand, a small folder, the same type of folder seen in the photograph outside the dining. Emily's evidence, the documents she had been trying to protect. Mercer had them. And suddenly the case had a new center. Daniel Rusk may have been the man who took Emily, but Calvin Mercer appeared to be the man controlling what happened inside the warehouse. The investigation now had to suspect 2 men, 1 victim, 1 hidden financial operation, and 1 final mystery. What happened during those 5 minutes behind the warehouse office door? The answer was hidden in a recording nobody knew existed, a voicemail left on Emily's home answering machine at 8:11 p.m. The original detectives had labeled it a blank message. Modern audio restoration revealed a faint voice. Emily, breathing hard, whispering, then 3 words. He knows everything. A second voice appeared behind her. Male, calm, close. And before the recording ended, Emily said one final sentence. Please don't let them find the file. Then the line went dead. The investigators listened in silence, because the voice behind Emily had just become the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. It belonged to someone they had not yet accused, someone who had remained outside the investigation for 36 years. And when they finally identified him, the entire story of Emily Carter's murder would change again. The voice behind Emily was not Daniel Rusk. It was Calvin Mercer. The identification came from an old recording taken from a completely different case. In 1991, Mercer had been questioned during an investigation into missing warehouse inventory. His voice had been recorded on a cassette. The audio was damaged, but the speech pattern remained clear enough for forensic comparison. The voice on Emily S. answering machine matched. There was no longer any doubt. Mercer had been with Emily that night. He had entered the warehouse office. He had taken the folder, and he had spoken to her moments before the line went dead. But the most disturbing discovery came next. The answering machine showed that the message had been received at 8:11 p.m., yet Emily S.'s phone had already stopped transmitting at 8:17. That meant the message was made while she was still alive. Someone had allowed her to call home. Why? Was it a mistake? A threat? Or had Emily been trying to leave a final warning? Investigators enhanced the recording again. Behind Mercer's voice, there was a mechanical sound, a low metallic vibration. They compared it with equipment used inside the warehouse. One machine produced the exact same sound, an industrial refrigeration unit located beside the office. That confirmed the recording had been made inside the warehouse. Emily had not called from her car. She had called from the building, and she had known she was in danger. The investigators replayed her final word. Please don't let them find the file. The file. Not files. One file. That suggested Emily had hidden something more important than the documents already recovered, something she believed could expose everyone involved. The search began again. Investigators returned to the old warehouse property. The building was gone. The land had been redeveloped, but the original architectural plan survived. The office had contained a small storage compartment behind a false wall. It had been used for maintenance records. The compartment was not visible from the main floor. Investigators wondered whether Emily had hidden the file there, but the building had been demolished. Nothing remained. Then an old employee gave investigators another clue. He remembered Mercer carrying a small metal briefcase out of the warehouse that night. Not a folder, a briefcase. He said Mercer held it tightly. He also remembered Rusk asking Mercer, "Did you get it?" Mercer answered, "She didn't have it." Those words changed the investigation. If Emily did not have the file, where was it? And what had she been protecting? Investigators searched her apartment again. They searched her workplace. They searched the grocery store. They searched the abandoned citrus grove. Nothing. Then they examined Emily S.'s personal planner. A small notation appeared beside October 18th. Locker 214. No location. No explanation. The investigators checked local storage facilities. There were dozens. Then they found an old employee directory from Emily S.'s workplace. Locker 214 belonged to a private records room inside the company building. The room had been demolished in 1998, but archived property documents showed the lockers had been removed and sold. One had gone to a local mechanic. The mechanic had kept it for years. When investigators found him, he remembered the number. The locker was still in his workshop. Rust covered the hinges. Inside was nothing, except a small envelope trapped beneath the bottom panel. The envelope contained a key and a handwritten note. Emily S. handwriting. "If they come for me, use the..." The key opened a safety deposit box. The box had been rented under Emily S.'s name. The bank had changed ownership twice, but the records remained. Inside the box was the missing file, not copied. Original documents, contracts, bank transfers, photographs, names, dates, and a handwritten statement from Emily. The statement explained everything she believed was happening. She wrote that shipments were being diverted through Suncoast Distribution. Insurance claims were being filed for goods that had never been lost. Money was being collected. Records were altered, and several employees were being paid to keep silent. But there was more. Emily had discovered that some of the stolen money was being moved through shell companies. One of those companies was connected to Calvin Mercer. Another was connected to Daniel Rutt. A third belonged to someone else. Someone whose name appeared at the top of the file, Frank Delaney. Delaney had been the regional operations director for the logistics company. He had supervised both Mercer and Rusk. He had also signed several of the suspicious shipping authorizations. But Delaney had never been questioned in the murder investigation. Not once. Investigators checked his history. In 1990, he had lived 20 minutes from the warehouse. He owned a dark sedan. He had access to company records. And, most importantly, he had been scheduled to meet Emily on the evening she disappeared. The meeting was listed in Emily S. Plan, 6:30 Delaney. But Emily never made that meeting. She left work before then. Why? Perhaps she discovered she could not trust him. Perhaps she had already realized the people around her were involved. The investigators compared Delaney's phone records. At 6:27 p.m., he called Mercer. At 7:02, he called Rupp. At 7:16, he called a number registered to a warehouse employee. At 7:48, his phone stopped making calls. The timing was too precise. Detectives searched for Delaney. He was 81. He lived in a retirement community in Central Florida. When investigators arrived, he was sitting on a balcony. He looked at the detectives, then at the photograph they carried. Emily. His expression changed. He knew exactly why they were there. He did not ask what case. He asked, "Did you find the box?" The investigators froze. "What box?" Delaney looked toward the floor. "The one she hid." That answer confirmed something enormous. Delaney knew about the safety deposit box. He knew Emily had hidden evidence, and he knew the investigators had found it. The interrogation became tense. Delaney denied killing Emily. He denied ordering her murder, but he admitted knowing about the warehouse operation. He said Mercer and Rusk had been stealing inventory. He claimed he had discovered the scheme too late. He said Emily had threatened to expose everyone. Then investigators asked him about the night she died. He remained silent. They asked whether he had spoken with Mercer. No answer. They asked whether he had spoken with Rusk. Silence. Then they placed the recovered documents in front of him. Delaney stared at them. One page showed a transfer of $25,000. The recipient was a company controlled by Mercer. The sender was a company controlled by Delaney. The date was October 19th, Sill, 1990, the day after Emily's murder. Delaney finally spoke. "I didn't pay them to kill her." The detectives looked at him. He had just admitted something he had never been asked about. They asked, "Then what did you pay them for?" Delaney closed his eyes. "To make the problem disappear." The room went silent. That sentence became the foundation of the next phase of the investigation. Delaney claimed he had not ordered Emily's death. He said Mercer and Rusk had confronted her without his permission, but investigators found contradiction. Delaney had called Mercer before Emily disappeared. He had called Rusk. He had transferred money the next morning, and he had personally visited the warehouse the following day. Why would he do that if he had nothing to hide? Delaney finally admitted he went there to retrieve documents. Which documents? The file. Emily's file? Yes. Why? Because it would have destroyed all of us. The detectives asked what he meant by all of us. Delaney refused to answer. Then he asked for a lawyer. The interview ended. But the investigators now had a fourth name, Delaney, and the case was expanding again. Emily had uncovered a criminal operation. Rusk had followed her. Mercer had confronted her. Delaney had been coordinating the network. The question was no longer simply who killed Emily. It was who had ordered the killing. The recovered documents offered another clue. A handwritten note appeared near the end of Emily's file. She had written, "Mercer says Delaney knows." Then, Rusk says Mercer is scared. And finally, someone above Delaney is paying them. That last sentence terrified investigators. Someone above Delaney. Who? They examined company records. Delaney reported to a corporate executive in Miami. His name was Victor Hale. Hale had been the company's national director of operations. He had approved Delaney's salary. He had approved major contract. He had access to financial accounts, and he had made several large payments connected to the same shell companies. Hale had died in 2007. Another dead man. Another person beyond prosecution. But investigators found a former assistant who was still alive. She remembered Hale receiving a call the morning after Emily disappeared. The assistant had heard him say, "Is it finished?" A pause. Then, "Good." She had assumed it was a business matter. Now she wondered. Investigators asked whether she remembered the call. She did. It was Delaney. The timeline became even darker. Hale, Delaney, Mercer, Russ. 4 men connected by money. 4 men connected to Emily. But only one had been caught on the final recording. Mercer, the man who had been inside the warehouse office with her. The man whose voice said she wasn't supposed to keep it. The investigators returned to the original evidence. The flashlight containing Emily S. DNA also contained Rusk's DNA. That suggested Rusk had physically handled the weapon. But Mercer's fingerprints were absent. Why? Because someone had wiped the flashlight. Rusk had touched it before it was clean. Mercer may have handled it with gloves, or perhaps Mercer had never touched it. Investigators needed Rusk to explain. They brought him back for another interview. This time, they confronted him with the warehouse footage. His face appeared on the screen. 7:52 p.m. Walking into the office, following Mercer, then leaving without Emily. Rusk watched silently. When the footage ended, he asked, "Did she suffer?" The detective did not answer. Rusk looked down, then whispered, "I told him not to do it." "Who?" "Mercer." "What did he do?" Rusk shook his head. "I didn't kill her." The detective pushed the photograph across the table. Emily, alive, standing beside him. Rusk stared at it. Then tears appeared. "I was supposed to scare her." "Who told you?" "Delaney." The room went completely silent. Rusk finally began talking. He said Delaney had ordered him to frighten Emily, not kill her. He said Mercer was supposed to take the documents. He said the plan was simple. Take the file, destroy it, convince Emily to stay quiet. But Emily refused. She fought. She screamed. She tried to escape. Rusk, said Mercer, became angry. Then the flashlight appeared. He heard the impact. Once, then again. Emily fell. Rusk said he froze. He claimed Mercer looked at him and said, "You're going to help me." Rusk helped move her. He admitted it. He admitted driving the vehicle. He admitted helping hide the body. But he insisted Mercer delivered the fatal blow. Then Rusk said something investigators had not expected. There was another man there. Who? Rusk hesitated. I never saw his face. Then how do you know? Because Mercer called him. When? After she died. Rusk remembered Mercer standing near the warehouse door. He had a phone in his hand. He said, "It's done." Then he listened. Then he said, "No, she didn't give it to us." A pause. Then, "Tell him." Rusk said Mercer looked terrified. The detective asked, "Tell who?" Rusk answered, "Delaney." But then he added, Delaney wasn't the person on the other end. The investigators asked who was. Rusk shook his head. I don't know. Did you hear a name? No. Anything? Rusk thought for several seconds, then whispered, Governor. The word hung in the room. Maybe Rusk had misheard. Maybe it was a nickname. Maybe it referred to someone powerful. But investigators could not ignore it, because Emily S. documents had already suggested someone above Delaney. And now Rusk was claiming Mercer had spoken to someone immediately after Emily died, someone he called Governor. The detectives searched every surviving phone record. One call from the warehouse at 8:04 p.m., a number registered to a private residence. The owner had been a former state official. And when investigators found the name, the case took its most shocking turn yet. The number belonged to a man who had publicly spoken about Emily Carteret's murder in 1990, a man who had demanded that police find her killer, a man who had appeared on television beside Emily's family, a man everyone believed was helping search for the truth. His name was Richard Vaughn, and at the time of Emily's murder, he was running for governor. Richard Vaughn had stood beside Emily's mother beneath television cameras in 1990. He had called the murder a tragedy that must not be forgotten. He had promised that the truth would eventually come out. 36 years later, investigators discovered that a call had been placed from the warehouse to a private number associated with Vaughn's campaign. The call lasted 43 seconds. 43 seconds. Long enough for Mercer to say something. long enough for Vaughn to answer, long enough for someone to give an instruction, but there was no recording of the call, only the number, only the time, only the connection. Vaughn was dead. He had died in 2011. He had never become governor, but he had come close, very close. And during the 1990 campaign, his political operation had received large donations from companies connected to Delaney. The investigators pulled the campaign records. They found transfers, consulting payments, donations routed through private corporations. Some of the money had moved within days of Emily S. murder. The same names appeared again: Delaney, Mercer, Rusk, and now Vaughn. It was becoming impossible to believe the connections were accidental, but the prosecutors needed more than coincidence. They needed proof. They returned to the recovered file from Emily S. safety deposit box. One document contained a list of companies. At the bottom, Emily had written, "Follow the money to V." The letter had been underlined. Vi. Vaughn? Investigators compared the handwriting with other notes. There was no doubt the line belonged to Emily. She had been following the money, and the money led toward a powerful political figure. But what exactly had Vaughn received? A financial analyst traced millions of dollars through shell companies. The money moved from Suncoast Distribution, then to a consulting company, then to a construction company, then to a political committee. The transfers were designed to look unrelated, but the same accountant had prepared several of the records. That accountant was still alive. Her name was Susan Bell. She agreed to speak. Bell was 78. She arrived at the interview carrying a folder. She placed it on the table, then said, "I've been waiting 36 years for someone to ask me the right question." The investigators asked what question that was. Bell answered, "Who told me to change the numbers?" She opened the folder. Inside were copies of financial statements, original figures, altered figures, and handwritten instructions. The handwriting belonged to Delaney, but one set of instructions had a different signature: R.Vi. Richard Vaughn. Bell explained that she had been ordered to move money between companies. She believed it was tax fraud. She did not understand the larger operation. Then Emily discovered the discrepancy. Emily approached Bell. She asked why the numbers were changing. Bell told her to leave it alone. Emily refused. She said she had already made copies. Bell remembered one sentence. She said she was going to the police. That was the moment everything changed. Bell said Delaney learned about the cop. Then Mercer became involved. Then Rusk. Then, according to Bell, Vaughn himself. She had never seen Vaughn at the warehouse, but she remembered a meeting at a hotel 3 days before Emily disappeared. Delaney was there. Mercer was there. Vaughn was there. Bell had been in an adjoining room. She heard Vaughn say, "Fix it before the election." Bell had never known what he meant. Now she believed she did. The investigators asked whether Vaughn had ordered Emily killed. Bell shook her head. "I never heard him say that." That distinction mattered. The case could prove conspiracy, financial corruption, cover-up. But murder required more. Then Bell revealed another document, a handwritten note from Delaney. It contained one sentence. "Vive says Bennett cannot reach the police." No mention of murder. No direct order. But the meaning was obvious. Someone wanted Emily stopped. The prosecutors now had motive. They had financial connections. They had the warehouse footage. They had Ruska's confession. They had Mercer S. voice. They had Emily S. notes. And they had evidence suggesting political influence. But there was still one missing piece. Who actually delivered the fatal blow? Rusk had named Mercer. The forensic evidence placed Rusk near the weapon. Mercer had been inside the office. The recovered recording contained Mercer S. voice. Yet there was no DNA from Mercer on Emily. The investigators returned to the flashlight. The blood had been identified as Emily S. Ruska's DNA was present. But beneath the flashlight's battery compartment was another trace, too degraded for an immediate match. The laboratory tried advanced sequencing. Weeks passed. Then the result arrived. A partial male profile. Not enough for a courtroom identification, but enough for a familial search. The investigators entered the profile. A possible relative appeared. A man living in Alabama. His surname was Mercer. Investigators froze. They checked the family tree. The man was Calvin Mercer's nephew. That meant the DNA recovered from the flashlight was almost certainly connected to Mercer's family. But investigators needed direct confirmation. Calvin Mercer was alive. He was 79. He had been living quietly in a retirement community under another surname. Detectives found him. They did not tell him what they had. They simply asked for an interview. Mercer agreed. He sat in a wheelchair. His hands trembled, but his eyes were sharp. The detective placed Emily's photograph on the table. Mercer looked at it, then looked away. Do you remember her? Yes. Did you know her? Yes. How well? Mercer said nothing. The detective placed the warehouse photograph beside it. Then the answering machine recording. Mercer heard his own voice. His face changed. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he whispered, "I thought that tape was gone." The detective leaned forward. Why? Mercer closed his eyes. Because Delaney said he destroyed it. That sentence was a confession of knowledge, but not yet a confession of murder. Mercer admitted being inside the warehouse. He admitted taking Emily's documents. He admitted threatening her. But he insisted he did not intend to kill her. He claimed Rusk attacked her. The detective asked, "Then why does your voice appear on the recording?" "I was there." "Why did you tell someone it was done?" "I meant the documents." "You told someone Emily was dead." Mercer looked toward the window. "I didn't know she was going to die." The detective pushed the flashlight photograph across the table. Mercer stared at it. Then the detective said, "Your nephew's DNA is consistent with the second profile." Mercer became pale. He finally admitted touching the flashlight, but he still denied striking Emily. Then investigators asked the question that had remained unanswered for 36 years. Who hit her? Mercer swallowed. "Rusk." "Why did you lie?" "Because Delaney told me to." "Why?" "Because if Rusk went down, everyone went down." The detective asked, "Everyone who?" Mercer looked directly at him, then said, "Everyone." He began naming them. Rusk, Delaney, Vaughn, and another person. A name nobody had expected. Emily's supervisor, Thomas Reed. Reed had been the man who first reported Emily missing. The man who told police she had left work normally. The man who claimed he knew nothing about the financial scheme. Mercer said Reed had been involved from the beginning. He had altered shipping records. He had warned Delaney when Emily began asking questions. And on the night Emily disappeared, Reed had called Mercer. He had told him Emily had the evidence. The investigators checked the phone record. The call existed. 6:54 p.m. 8 minutes after Emily left the workplace. Reed had called Mercer. Then Mercer called Rusk. Then Rusk followed Emily. The chain was becoming complete. But Reed was already dead. He had died in 1998. Another critical witness gone. Still, his old computer records survived. Investigators recovered archive files. One folder was password protected. The password was eventually cracked. Inside was a spreadsheet. Names, payments, dates. And beside Emily's name, remove file, contains subject. The entry was dated October 18th, SIL, 1990, the day she died. The investigators stared at the screen. This was no longer an accidental killing. Someone had deliberately identified Emily as a problem. Someone had ordered her silenced. The question was whether the instruction meant murder. Then they found another entry. October 19th. Subject terminated. There was no ambiguity now. The language was cold, corporate, clinical. But the meaning was unmistakable. Emily had been terminated. The next column listed an amount, $50,000. The recipient? Calvin Mercer. Another $25,000 went to Rusk. Another $100,000 moved into a political account connected to Vaughn. The money had moved immediately after Emily's death. The prosecutors finally had what they needed, a financial trail connecting the murder to the larger conspiracy. But the case was about to become even more explosive, because one name on the spreadsheet had not yet been investigated. A name above Delaney, above Mercer. Above Rusk, above Reed, a person listed only by initial, JV. Investigators believed it might be Vaughn, but the financial records suggested otherwise. JV was not Richard Vaughn. It was someone else. Someone who was still alive. Someone who had never been questioned. Someone who had been present at the company headquarters the week Emily disappeared. The investigators traced the initials to an executive named Jonathan Vale. Vale had been the company's legal advisor. He had handled contracts. He had controlled internal investigation. He had also represented the company when Emily's murder became public. And there was something else. Vale had personally advised police that they should focus on Mark Holloway, the same suspect who had been falsely targeted for years. He had helped create the original narrative. The investigators searched Vale's history. He was 86, still alive, still living in Florida, still receiving a pension from the company. And when detectives arrived at his home, they found something on the wall, a photograph. Emily Carter. Vale had been keeping it for 36 years, not hidden, not locked away, displayed. The detective stared at it. Vale noticed, then said quietly, "She was a very stubborn woman." The investigator asked, "Why do you have her photograph?" Vale answered, "Because I remember what happened." The room went silent. For the first time in 36 years, someone connected to the case had admitted knowing the truth. But Vale was not finished. He looked at the photograph, then said, "Rusk didn't kill her." The detective asked, "Who did?" Vale looked toward the door, then whispered, "Mercer." But the detective already knew that. The real question was, who ordered Mercer? Vale gave an answer that would send the entire investigation into its final and most dangerous phase. Delaney. Then he added, "But Delaney wasn't the one who made the decision." The detective leaned closer. "Who did?" Vale looked at him and said one name, Vaughn. But there was a problem. Vaughn was dead, and without him, prosecutors needed another way to prove the order had been given. Vale claimed there was a recording made the night before Emily died, a recording that had been hidden for decades. And according to Vale, it contained the exact words investigators had been searching for since 1990. The order to silence Emily. The recording was hidden somewhere unexpected, not in a police archive, not in a warehouse, not in a safe. It was inside a personal collection belonging to a dead political aide, and the investigators knew where that collection had been stored. The search warrant was signed the following morning. When the storage unit was opened, detectives found hundreds of boxes, campaign records, photographs, old newspapers, cassette tapes. One tape was labeled only with a date, October 17th, Sill, 1990, the day before Emily disappeared. The investigators carried it into the evidence room. They placed it into a restored cassette player. The machine clicked. The tape began to turn. Static. A chair moving. Someone breathing. Then a voice. "Richard Vaughn. Tomorrow, this ends." A second voice answered. "Calvin Mercer. What if she talks?" Vaughn replied, "She won't." A pause. Then another voice entered. "Daniel Rusk." And Vaughn said the sentence that prosecutors had spent decades searching for. "Make sure she never reaches the police." The tape continued. Then came the sound of a door closing. The recording ended. Nobody in the room moved. 36 years of silence had finally broken. And now investigators had the one thing the original case never had: the order, the motive, the money, the witnesses, the DNA, the confession, and a recording that could finally prove that Emily Carter's death was not an accident. It was planned. But the final question remained: who struck the first blow? And when prosecutors confronted Calvin Mercer with that recording, he finally told them what happened inside the warehouse office during those 5 minutes when the world lost sight of Emily Carter. The recording ended with a click. For several seconds, nobody in the evidence room moved. The words remained suspended in the air. "Make sure she never reaches the police." 36 years. That was how long those words had been buried. 36 years since Emily Carter walked out of work believing she would be home before dinner. 36 years since her mother waited beside a telephone that never rang. 36 years since a quiet Florida town learned that someone could disappear in plain sight. Now the investigators had something the original detectives never had: a voice, a command, a plan. But the recording did not prove who carried out the final act. That question still belonged to the 5 minutes inside the warehouse office. The detectives returned to Calvin Mercer. He had already admitted being there. He had admitted taking Emily S. documents. He had admitted lying. But he still denied striking her. This time they played the record. Mercer listened without interrupting. When Vaughn's voice said, "Make sure she never reaches the police," Mercer closed his eyes. When Rusk's voice appeared, his hands began trembling. When the tape ended, the detective placed it on the table. "Tell us what happened." Mercer stared at the tape. Then he said, "She fought harder than they expected." That was the beginning. Not a confession. Not yet. But the wall was cracking. Mercer explained that Emily had been brought into the warehouse office because Delaney believed she had hidden copies of the financial records. They wanted the location. They wanted the evidence. They believed she would give it up if she understood what was at stake. But Emily refused. She told them she had already sent copies to someone outside the company. Mercer said he did not believe her. Rusk became nervous. He wanted to leave. Emily noticed. She looked directly at him. She told him he was being used. Mercer said Rusk became angry. He grabbed her arm. Emily pulled away. She reached for the office door. Rusk blocked it. Then Emily screamed. Someone struck the door from the outside. Mercer opened it. No one was there. But a few seconds later, Rusk returned holding the metal flashlight. Mercer said he asked him what he was doing. Rusk answered, "She knows too much." The detectives listened. Then what happened? Mercer looked down. He hit her. Once. A sharp blow. Emily fell against the desk. She was still conscious, still breathing, still trying to speak. Mercer said she looked at him and asked, "Why?" He said he had no answer. She crawled toward the desk. She reached for the telephone. Mercer pulled the cord away. Then Emily said something that Mercer remembered decades later. She said, "They'll know." The detective asked who she meant. Mercer answered, "Everyone." Emily knew. She knew the evidence would eventually be found. She knew the people involved could not erase everything. Mercer said Rusk panicked. He struck her again. This time, Emily stopped moving. The room went silent. The detective asked, "Was she dead?" Mercer shook his head. "No." That answer changed the case again. Emily was alive. Barely. And someone made a decision. Mercer said he called Delaney. Delaney told him to wait. Then another call came. The same mysterious number that had appeared in the original phone records. The number connected to Richard Vaughn. Mercer said he answered. He listened. Then said only, "Yes." The detective asked, "What did Vaughn tell you?" Mercer hesitated. He said the situation couldn't be allowed to continue. "Did he tell you to kill her?" Mercer looked at the floor. "No." "Then what did he say?" Mercer swallowed. He said there couldn't be a witness. That was enough. The prosecutors would later argue that the language was deliberately vague. No direct words. No explicit command. But everyone inside that room understood what it meant. Mercer said he and Rusk carried Emily through the rear door. They placed her inside her own vehicle. The same vehicle later found beside the citrus grove. Emily was still alive. That detail haunted investigators. She had not died immediately. She had been conscious, terrified, and still capable of seeing the people around her. Rusk drove. Mercer followed in his truck. They left the warehouse. The road was almost empty. The rain had begun. They reached the citrus grove. Emily was removed from the car. She tried to stand. She could not. Mercer said Rusk looked at him. "What are we going to do?" Mercer answered, "Finish it." The detectives asked who delivered the final blow. Mercer said, "Rusk." But then he added something unexpected. "I held her down." The room went silent again. That meant both men had participated. Rusk struck her. Mercer restrained her. And Emily died in the grove. But Mercer claimed something else happened before they left. Emily had whispered a final sentence. He remembered every word. "She'll find you." The detective asked, "Who?" Mercer said, "I don't know." "Who did Emily mean?" Mercer looked toward the window, then said, "Her mother." That answer seemed almost insignificant, but it wasn't, because Emily's mother had spent decades asking questions. She had never accepted the original theory. She had never believed Mark Holloway was responsible. She had kept every letter, every photograph, every newspaper clipping, every piece of information police gave her, and one document she had never shown investigators, a letter Emily had written 2 days before her death. The letter had been discovered after her mother died in 2016. Her brother found it inside an old cookbook. The envelope had never been opened. Inside was a single page. Emily had written, "Mom, if anything happens to me, don't believe the first story they tell you." That sentence now carried terrifying weight, because the first story had been Mark Holloway, the angry ex-boyfriend, the obvious suspect, the convenient suspect. The man police could investigate immediately, but Holloway had not killed Emily. The real suspects had been standing somewhere else, watching, waiting, and influencing the investigation from behind the scenes. The detectives returned to Holloway. He was now 73. He had spent most of his adult life carrying the suspicion. His marriage had ended. His career had suffered. People in town had whispered about him for years. Some had believed he was guilty. He had never been charged. When investigators finally told him that new evidence had cleared him, he did not celebrate. He simply sat quietly. Then he asked, "Did you find out who did it?" "Yes." Holloway stared at the floor. "Then why did it take so long?" The detective had no easy answer. Because the case had not failed because there were no clues. It had failed because the clues had been separated. A fingerprint here, a financial record there, a forgotten witness, a damaged tape, a note inside a locker, a call buried in an archive, a DNA sample waiting for technology that did not exist in 1990. One piece meant nothing. Together they told the story. But investigators still needed to establish exactly how Emily died. The medical examiner's office had preserved her original autopsy material. Modern forensic specialists reviewed them. The injuries were consistent with multiple blunt force impacts. The fatal injury had been to the back of the head. The flashlight was consistent with the wound. Emily's DNA was on it. Rusk's DNA was on it. And the family-linked profile suggested Mercer had handled it. There was no longer a realistic alternative explanation, but prosecutors wanted more. They wanted the truth from the men themselves. Rusk had already confessed to striking Emily. Mercer had admitted restraining her. Now investigators wanted to know whether Delaney had personally ordered the attack. Delaney was still alive, still refusing to accept responsibility. But the financial records were overwhelming. On October 19, 1990, less than 12 hours after Emily's death, Delaney transferred $25,000 to an account controlled by Rusk. Another payment went to Mercer. A third went through a political organization connected to Vaughn. The amounts matched the handwritten instructions found in Emily's file. The prosecutors confronted Delaney. He stared at the documents, then laughed. Not because they were false, because he realized there was nowhere left to hide. "You think this proves murder?" The detective answered, "No, your own words do." They showed him the recovered record. Delaney heard Vaughn. He heard Mercer. He heard himself mentioned. His expression changed. Then the detective played another recording, a conversation between Delaney and Mercer recorded during the recent investigation. Mercer had secretly agreed to cooperate. Delaney had spoken freely. He had said, "She was never supposed to become a problem." The detective stopped the recording. Delaney said nothing. Then they played the next line. Mercer had asked, "Did Vaughn know?" Delaney answered, "Vaughn knew everything." The room went silent. Delaney finally admitted that Vaughn had been involved. He admitted that Emily's discovery threatened the entire financial operation. He admitted that he had been instructed to make sure the evidence disappeared, but he still insisted he had not ordered her death. Then the detective asked, "Who gave the final instruction?" Delaney stared at him. Mercer. Mercer says you did. Then he's lying. Rusk says you did. Rusk is a murderer. Emily's records say Vaughn did. Delaney stopped. For the first time, he looked frightened. Then he said, Vaughn didn't give orders directly. What does that mean? He never had to. How did you know what he wanted? Delaney said nothing. The detective waited. Finally, Delaney whispered, because he made it clear. Those 4 words became central to the prosecution, because the operation had been built around plausible deniability. No written murder order. No direct instruction. No signed document. Only conversations. Payments. Warnings. Threats. And people who understood what powerful men meant without needing them to say the word. But there was still one final piece. The investigators needed to know why Emily had been so dangerous. What exactly had she discovered? The recovered file contained the answer. It was not only about stolen shipments. It was about something much larger. The company had been moving controlled materials through legitimate distribution channels. The records had been altered. Shipments were being redirected. Payments were being concealed. And several officials had benefited. Emily had found the paper trail. She had copied it. She had hidden it. And she had planned to expose it. That was why she had been marked as a problem. That was why she had been followed. That was why she had been taken to the warehouse. That was why the murder had been covered up. And that was why the investigation had been pushed toward an innocent man. The prosecutors now prepared arrest warrants. But there was one complication. Calvin Mercer was cooperating. Daniel Rusk had confessed. Delaney was facing charges. Yet one major figure remained. Richard Vaughn was dead. So investigators could not arrest him. But they could still expose his role. And they could still prosecute the men who had carried out his plan. The announcement was scheduled for 9 a.m. News crews gathered outside the courthouse. Reporters expected an update. They did not know the scale of what was coming. At 8:57, the doors opened. Investigators walked outside carrying a box of evidence. Inside were photographs, tapes, financial records, DNA reports, the old flashlight, and Emily Carteret's final letter. The case that had been called unsolvable was about to become one of the most shocking cold case breakthroughs the town had ever seen. Then the prosecutor stepped toward the microphone. He looked directly into the camera and said, "Tonight, after 36 years, Emily Carter's family will finally hear the truth." Behind him stood detectives, and beside them stood Daniel Rusk, handcuffed, head lowered, the man who had spent decades hiding what happened in a Florida warehouse. But there was another arrest that stunned everyone. A man investigators had not publicly named until that morning. A man who had been living under the protection of another identity. A man connected directly to the final decision that ended Emily's life. His name was Calvin Mercer. And when the cameras turned toward him, he finally said the words the town had waited 36 years to hear. "I should have stopped it." Then he looked toward Emily's family. "I didn't." The courtroom doors opened, and the cold case that had survived 3 generations was finally moving toward trial. The courtroom was packed before sunrise. Reporters filled the benches. Cameras waited outside. Emily Carteret's family sat together in the second row. Nobody spoke. For 36 years, they had waited for this moment. Now the men accused of taking Emily's life were finally being brought into court. Daniel Rusk entered first. His wrists were chained. His face was expressionless. Then Calvin Mercer appeared, older, slower, pale. But when he saw Emily's family, he stopped walking. Emily's brother Daniel looked directly at him. Neither man spoke. The silence was heavier than any courtroom statement. Then came the prosecutors. They carried boxes of evidence. Not one box. 6. 6 boxes containing the fragments of a murder investigation that had survived 36 years. Inside were the original photographs, the warehouse tape, the answering machine recording, the financial documents, the flashlight, the DNA reports, and Emily's handwritten notes. The judge ordered the courtroom sealed for part of the hearing because several pieces of evidence remained under review. Outside, reporters were already calling it one of the biggest cold case developments in the state, but the prosecutors knew something the public did not. The evidence was strong, yet the case was not simple. Mercer was elderly. Rusk had confessed. Delaney had admitted knowledge of the operation, and the man accused of giving the order was dead. The prosecution had to prove that the living suspects were responsible for Emily S.'s death. They began with the timeline. October 18th, Sill, 1990, 5:47 p.m. Rusk arrived at Emily S.'s workplace. 6:12. Emily left. 6:26. She stopped at the grocery store. 6:41. She called her mother. 7:03. Her car was seen heading east. 7:19. A gas station camera captured it. 7:31. Rusk's truck was seen beside Emily S.'s vehicle. 7:34. A witness saw Emily arguing with a man. 7:44. Rusk's truck passed a toll station. 30 seconds later, Emily S.'s car followed. 7:52. Warehouse footage showed Rusk, Mercer, and Emily entering the building. 8:04. A call was placed from the warehouse. 8:11. Emily S.'s final message reached her home. 8:17. Her phone stopped transmitting. The timeline was brutal. There were no unexplained hours, no mysterious detour, no strangers suddenly appearing. The evidence showed a chain, one event leading directly into the next. The prosecution then introduced the warehouse tape. The courtroom lights were dimmed. The recording began. Static. A door. Footsteps. Then Emily S.'s voice. The jurors heard her breathing. They heard Mercer. They heard Rusk. And then they heard the words, "She knows too much." The room became completely silent. The prosecutor stopped the recorder. He did not need to explain what the jury had just heard. The evidence spoke for itself. But the defense attacked the recorder. They argued the tape had been damaged. They questioned the audio enhancement. They claimed voices could have been misidentified. Then the prosecution introduced the forensic comparison. Independent experts had matched Mercer's voice using recordings from 1991. The probability of the match being accidental was extraordinarily low. The defense objected. The judge allowed the evidence. Then came the DNA. Emily S.'s DNA on the flashlight. Rusk's DNA on the flashlight. A family-linked profile associated with Mercer. The defense argued that Rusk's DNA could have been transferred. The prosecutors expected that. They presented another piece of evidence. The fingerprint from Emily S.'s passenger window. Daniel Rusk's fingerprint. The same fingerprint investigators had photographed in 1990. It had been sitting in storage for decades. Untested. Unmatched. Waiting. The defense attorney stared at the report, then asked, "Why wasn't this tested before?" The forensic expert answered, "Because the technology did not exist in a practical form at the time." The courtroom murmured. The expert continued, "The evidence was preserved. That is why we were able to test it decades later." That sentence mattered. The case had not been solved because investigators suddenly discovered something new. It had been solved because old evidence finally became readable. Then prosecutors introduced the financial records. The jury saw the payments. $25,000 to Rusk, $50,000 to Mercer. Money moved immediately after Emily S.'s death. The defense argued that the payments were unrelated. The prosecution produced the handwritten instruction. Names, amounts, dates, and the phrase, "Subject terminated." The handwriting expert confirmed it belonged to Delaney, but Delaney was not in court. He had died before charges could be filed. That created a problem. Statements from a dead suspect could be challenged, but the financial evidence remained. So did the recordings. Then the prosecution called Susan Bell. She walked slowly into the courtroom. She was nearly 80. She took the witness stand. She looked toward Emily S.'s family, then toward the defendants. She identified Mercer. She identified Rusk. And when shown a photograph of Delaney, she said, "He told me to change the numbers." The prosecutor asked why. Bell answered, "Because Emily had discovered the truth." She explained the financial scheme, the missing shipments, the altered records. the shell companies, the political payments, the money moving through multiple accounts. She told the jury Emily had confronted her. She said Emily had told her, "If I don't report this, someone else will get hurt." The prosecutor asked, "Did Emily ever say she was afraid?" Bell nodded. "She said she was afraid of one person." "Who?" Bell looked toward the evidence table. "Calvin Mercer." Mercer lowered his head. Bell continued. "She said he had been watching her." The defense attempted to discredit Bell. They pointed out that she had waited decades before coming forward. Bell did not deny it. She simply said, "I was afraid." The prosecutor asked, "Afraid of what?" Bell answered, "Being next." The courtroom fell silent. Then came the testimony of the former warehouse employee. He described the night Emily died. He identified Mercer. He identified Rusk. He described seeing Emily arguing with them. He remembered the words, "You promised me." The defense asked why he never told police. He admitted he was terrified. The prosecutor asked, "Did anyone threaten you?" "Yes." "Who?" "Mercer." The courtroom turned toward the defendant. Mercer did not look up. Then the prosecutor introduced another witness, a former campaign employee who had worked for Richard Vaughn. She testified that Vaughn had received calls from Delaney. She remembered the phrase, "Fix it before the election." The defense objected. The judge allowed limited testimony. Then the prosecutor introduced the campaign records, large payments, shell companies, consulting fee, money moving in circles. The connection was becoming undeniable. Emily had discovered the money. She had threatened to expose it. She was taken to the warehouse. She was assaulted. She died. Then the money moved. The prosecution had built a narrative from thousands of small pieces, but the most powerful evidence came from Daniel Rusk himself. He took the stand. His attorney warned him that he was exposing himself to enormous legal consequences. Rusk agreed. He wanted to tell the truth. He looked at Emily S. family. "I lied for 36 years. Emily S. mother was not there. She had died before the case was solved. Her son sat beside the empty chair she would have occupied." Rusk continued, "I told myself I was protecting my family." He paused. "But I was protecting myself." The prosecutor asked him what happened inside the warehouse. Rusk described Emily fighting. He described the flashlight. He described the moment she fell. Then he described the phone call. Mercer called Delaney. The prosecutor asked, "Did you hear Delaney?" "Yes." "What did he say?" Rusk answered. "He said, 'Do what you have to do.'" The defense objected. The judge allowed the testimony because Rusk was describing his own experience. The prosecutor asked, "Did you understand what that meant?" Rusk looked toward the jury. "Yes." "What did you understand?" "That Emily couldn't leave." The courtroom was silent. Rusk described the drive to the citrus grove. He described the rain. He described Emily trying to breathe. He described Mercer telling him to finish it. The prosecutor asked, "Did you kill Emily Carter?" Rusk took a long breath. "Yes." A gasp moved through the courtroom. But he immediately added, "Mercer told me to." The prosecutor turned toward Mercer. "Did you tell him to kill her?" Mercer did not answer. Rusk continued, "I hit her, but Mercer held her down." The prosecutor asked, "Why?" Rusk said, "Because she was still alive." Then came the most painful moment of the testimony. Rusk described Emily looking at him. "She knew me." The prosecutor asked, "What did she say?" Rusk wiped his eyes. "She said my name." He paused. Then she said, "Please." Emily S. brother closed his eyes. Rusk continued, "I did it anyway." No dramatic music. No shouting. Just silence. 36 years of silence finally breaking inside a courtroom. But the defense was not finished. They argued Rusk was shifting blame. They argued Mercer had manipulated him. They argued the financial records proved corruption, but not murder. Then prosecutors played the final recording, the tape from October 17th. Richard Vaughn's voice filled the courtroom. "Tomorrow, this ends." Mercer, "What if she talks?" Vaughn, "She won't." Rusk, "What do you want us to do?" A pause. Then Vaughn, make sure she never reaches the police. The recording ended. The jury listened without moving. The prosecutor turned toward them. There are crimes that disappear because evidence is lost, he said. And there are crimes that survive because someone was determined to remember. He pointed toward the evidence. This case survived because Emily Carter left a trail, a fingerprint, a note, a hidden key, a financial record, a voice, a final warning. The defense asked the jury to consider the passage of time. 36 years. Memories could change. Evidence could deteriorate. Witnesses could misremember. The prosecutor agreed. Yes, he said. Time changes everything. Then he pointed to the DNA. But DNA doesn't remember incorrectly. He pointed to the fingerprint. Fingerprints don't grow old. He pointed to the tape. And a recording made 36 years ago does not suddenly decide to tell a different story. The jury left to deliberate. Hours passed. Emily S. brother sat alone. He held the old photograph. The same photograph from the night she disappeared. Emily smiling beside a birthday cake. A young woman who believed she would see her family the next morning. She never did. At 6:18 p.m., the jury returned. Everyone stood. The clerk read the verdict. Guilty. On the first count. Guilty. On the second. Guilty. On the murder charge. Daniel Rusk lowered his head. Calvin Mercer closed his eyes. Emily S. brother began to cry. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. After 36 years, there was finally a verdict. But the case did not end there. Because the investigators still had one final piece of evidence. A piece that explained why Emily had been so determined to expose the conspiracy. A document found inside the safety deposit box. It contained a list of names. Not 4, not 5, 23. And beside several names was a handwritten symbol. A small black circle. The meaning was unknown, until investigators compared the list with old company records. The circles marked people who had received payments. Some had died. Some had disappeared from public light. Some were still alive. And one name stood out. A person Emily had trusted. A person who had helped her gather evidence. A person who had never been considered a suspect. Her own supervisor. Thomas Reed. Beside his name was a black circle. And beneath it, Emily had written for word. He knows where it is. The investigators realized the file found in the safety deposit box might not be the complete file. There could be another, one that Emily had hidden somewhere else, one that could reveal the full network. And if Emily had hidden it before she died, then someone had been searching for it for 36 years. The cold case was solved. But the mystery was not over. Because somewhere in Florida, perhaps inside an abandoned property, an old storage locker, or a forgotten family home, there could still be one final piece of Emily Carter's evidence. And the person who had spent decades trying to keep it hidden might still be alive. The name Thomas Reed had been sitting in the original case file for 36 years. He had been described as Emily Carter's supervisor, helpful, cooperative, concerned, the man who reported her missing. The man who told detectives she had seemed normal when she left work. The man who said he had no idea where she had gone. Now investigators were looking at his name again, not as a witness, as part of the conspiracy. Reed had died in 1998. There would be no interrogation, no courtroom confrontation, no confession. But his records remained. And when investigators compared his surviving files with Emily's hidden documents, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Emily had written, "He knows where it is." The question was simple. Where was it? The investigators believed it referred to the final evidence Emily had hidden before her death, something more important than the financial records, something that could identify everyone involved. They began reconstructing Reed's final months. After Emily's murder, Reed had remained with the company for nearly 7 years. He received promotions. He purchased a larger home. He paid off his debts. Then, in 1998, he suddenly resigned. 3 weeks later, he died from a heart attack. His widow had moved out of the house shortly afterward. The property had changed owners several times, but the investigators discovered something strange. The house had a detached garage, and according to an old property photograph, the garage had once contained a concrete storage pit. The pit was later sealed. Why? Nobody knew. The investigators obtained the original building plan. The storage pit had been constructed in 1989, 1 year before Emily was murdered. That detail immediately raised suspicion, but suspicion was not evidence. They needed something more. So they searched Reed's financial history. 3 months after Emily's death, Reed purchased a second property, a small house near the coast. The purchase was made almost entirely in cash. The money came from an account that had been dormant for years. Investigators traced the deposit. They led back to one of Delaney's shell companies, then to Mercer, then to a political fund associated with Vaughn. The same network, the same money, the same names. Reed had been paid. The investigators returned to Emily's notes. Her handwriting became increasingly urgent during the final week of her life. One page contained a strange sentence. Reed keeps asking about the blue box. The investigators immediately searched old workplace inventory. There had been a blue metal document box. It was used for confidential shipping records. It disappeared shortly before Emily's death. Nobody had reported it missing. Nobody had filed a replacement request. It simply vanished. The investigators wondered whether the box was it. But where had it gone? They searched Reed's old property. The garage was still there. The concrete storage pit had been filled decades earlier. A ground-penetrating scan revealed an unusual rectangular shape beneath the floor. The investigators obtained a warrant. The concrete was cut open. Beneath it was a metal container. Blue, rusting, sealed. The room went silent. 36 years after Emily disappeared, investigators were looking at the object she had apparently feared would fall into the wrong hand. The box was opened carefully. Inside were documents wrapped in plastic, a cassette tape, 3 photographs, and a handwritten statement. The first photograph showed the warehouse. The second showed several men entering a private meeting. The third showed Richard Vaughn standing beside Calvin Mercer. But the fourth item was the most important, the cassette. It was labeled, "For Mom." Investigators restored the tape. Emily's voice appeared through the static. She sounded frightened, but calm. She knew something was coming. She said she had discovered the money transfer. She said she believed Reed was helping Delaney. She said Mercer had threatened her. Then she mentioned Vaughn. She did not say he had ordered her death. She said something more revealing. He knows about the records. A pause. Then, if something happens to me, the records are not the only thing that matters. The investigators leaned closer. Emily continued. There is a list. The tape crackled. A list of people who were paid. Another pause. Some of them don't even know why. That meant the conspiracy could be larger than anyone had believed. Emily had not only discovered criminal activity, she had discovered a network involving people who might not even understand their own role. The tape continued. I put the list somewhere Reed can't find. Then Emily said the sentence that changed the entire search. Mom knows the place. But Emily's mother was dead, and nobody had ever asked her. The investigators searched her belongings. Her house had been emptied after her death. Most possessions had gone to Emily's brother, but one object had been donated to a local church, a wooden sewing box. Emily's mother had kept it for decades. The investigators located it. Inside were needles, thread, old photographs, letters, and a small brass key. The key had a number engraved on it, 314. Investigators traced the number. It belonged to a railway storage locker. The facility had been demolished in 2003, but archived records showed that Emily's mother had rented locker 314 in 1991, 6 months after Emily's death. That made no sense. Why would her mother rent a locker unless Emily had told her about it? The investigators searched the old rental records. The locker had been paid in cash. No address, no phone number, no explanation. Then they found the access log. One entry. Emily's mother had visited the locker twice. The first time was March 1991. The second was June 1991. After that, no one. The investigators searched the demolition archive. Before the storage facility was destroyed, every remaining locker had been cleared. Most contents were discarded, but some were transferred to a municipal warehouse. The records were incomplete. Investigators located the warehouse. Boxes were stacked from floor to ceiling. Thousands of forgotten objects. Old furniture, files, tools, personal belongings. They searched for locker 314. Nothing. Then one investigator noticed a box marked "Owned, Unclaimed 1991. Inside was a small metal container, blue, the same color as the missing document box. It contained another envelope. This one was addressed to Emily S. mother. The handwriting was Emily S. Inside was a single page. If you are reading this, they already know. Her mother had never opened it. Or perhaps she had. There was no way to know. The investigators continued reading. Emily had written that she feared Reed. She feared Mercer. She feared Delaney. But there was another name. A person outside the company. A private investigator. Emily believed he had been hired to monitor her. His name was Arthur Bell. He was not related to Susan Bell. He had worked as a private investigator in 1990. His specialty was corporate surveillance. Emily believed he had followed her. She wrote, "Bell knows where I go." The investigators searched his history. Arthur Bell had died in 2009, but his son was alive. He agreed to speak. He brought several boxes from his father's office. Inside were old surveillance photographs. Most were meaningless. Then one image appeared. Emily, walking out of work. Another, Emily entering the grocery store. Another, Emily talking to Calvin Mercer. Another, Emily meeting Thomas Reed. Someone had been following her for weeks. Then investigators found the final photograph. It was taken on October 18th, still 1990, the night Emily disappeared. The photograph showed Emily beside her car. Across the street stood Daniel Rusk, but Rusk was not alone. A second man was standing behind a telephone pole. His face was partially obscured. The investigators enlarged the image. The man was wearing a dark jacket. His posture was familiar. They compared him with old photographs of Thomas Reed. The height matched. The build matched. But the face was hidden. Then they noticed something in his hand. A small object. A radio. The same model used by private security teams. Arthur Bell's son remembered his father mentioning the photograph. He said his father had once told him, "I was paid to watch her, not protect her." That sentence raised another question. Who had hired him? His son found the original invoice. The client name was hidden behind a corporate account, but the payment had come from a company controlled by Delaney. The investigators now knew Emily had been watched, not by accident. Someone had tracked her movements. Someone knew when she left work. Someone knew where she went. Someone knew about the documents. The operation had been watching her before the murder, and the deeper investigators went, the clearer the motive became. Emily had not stumbled into danger. Danger had been watching her. The prosecution reopened its theory. They now believed the murder was the final stage of an organized effort to silence her. Rusk was the enforcer. Mercer was the intermediary. Reed was the insider. Delaney was the organizer. Vaughn was the political shield. And Arthur Bell had been hired to monitor Emily. But there was still something missing. The list. The list of people Emily had mentioned on the tape. The list that could expose the entire network. Investigators believed the blue box contained part of it, but not the whole thing. The recovered documents included names, payments, dates. Yet Emily had specifically said there was another list, a list of people who had been paid without knowing why. Why would that matter? Because those people could have been innocent, and if their names were exposed, the entire conspiracy might collapse. Investigators searched Emily's family records again. Then they discovered an old letter from Emily's mother. It had been written 1 week after the murder. She had written, "Emily told me there was a place nobody would look. No address, no name, just that sentence." Beneath it was a hand-drawn symbol, a circle, with a small line through the center. Investigators compared the symbol with Emily's note. It appeared repeatedly, on her planner, on the warehouse records, on the back of a photograph, and on the envelope recovered from locker 314. The symbol was not a warning. It was a location marker. Investigators mapped every place where Emily had drawn it: her workplace, the warehouse, the citrus grove, the railway station. Then one final location appeared: a small public library. Emily had visited it 3 times during the month before her death. The library had a basement archive. In 1990, the archive stored newspapers, property records, and public documents. Emily had spent hours there. Investigators reviewed the old sign in records. Her name appeared on October 15th, October 16th, October 17th, 3 consecutive days. The day before her murder, Emily had spent nearly 2 hours in the archive. What had she been searching for? The answer was hidden in a newspaper microfilm record: a property transaction, a warehouse, a shell company, and a name: Richard Vaughn. But the document showed something even more disturbing. Vaughn had secretly purchased property adjacent to the citrus grove, not publicly, through another company. The property had been purchased 6 weeks before Emily's death. Why? Because it provided private access to the grove, a back road. No camera, no houses nearby. A perfect place to disappear. Investigators returned to the property records. The company that owned the land had been dissolved shortly after Emily's murder. The property was later sold. The money went into another shell company, and the paper trail eventually led back to Delaney. The case was becoming airtight. But one final question remained. Why had Emily S.'s mother known where to look? The investigators listened to Emily S.'s final recording again. If something happens to me, Mom knows the place. Maybe Emily had told her. Maybe the location was somewhere personal, somewhere only the two of them understood. Then Emily S.'s brother remembered something. Their mother had always taken Emily to one place when they were children: a small church outside town. Not because of religion, because behind the church was an old memorial garden. Emily and her mother had planted a tree there, a young orange tree. Emily had once joked that it was the one place nobody would ever search. Investigators went there. The tree was still standing, 36 years older, much larger. Beneath it was a stone. Emily's name was carved into the surface, but behind the stone was a small metal compartment. Inside was a final envelope. The investigators opened it. There was no money, no photographs, no financial records, only a handwritten page. Emily had written, "If they find the blue box, they will think they have everything." The investigators read the next sentence. They don't. Then came a list. 23 names. The real list. And beside the first name was a black circle. Beside the second, the third, the fourth. But one name had no circle. Instead, Emily had drawn a line through it. The name was not Reed, not Mercer, not Rusk, not Delaney, not Vaughn. It was someone investigators had never suspected. Someone who had helped the police investigate Emily S.'s murder in 1990. Someone who had been inside the evidence room. Someone who had personally handled the case file. And next to his name, Emily had written 5 words. "He knows I found out."